Welcome to our environmental racism series, People on the Margins, hosted by Decatur First United Methodist Church. Today, we are having the pleasure of Whitney Brown, who's the communications manager for Georgia Interfaith Power and Light. Whitney graduated from Agnes Scott College with a BA in Psychology and Music History and Emory University with a Master's of Divinity. Thank you, Whitney.
Thanks for having me. Michael gave me a great welcome. I appreciate that. I've been the communications manager at GIPL for almost 3 years now, 2.5 years. And we are really working our way towards doing more environmental justice work, especially in light of recent events. So I'll give you a little bit of background on GIPL, and then we'll sort of talk about the different nuances of environmental racism, environmental justice, and where that intersects with systemic racism as well. So GIPL's mission, as you can see, is Georgia Interfaith Power and Light engages communities of faith and stewardship of creation as a direct expression of our faithfulness and as a religious response to global climate change, resource depletion, environmental injustice, pollution, and other disruptions in creation. So sort of the short version of that would be we use a lens of faith, whether it's Christian, Buddhist, Jewish, whatever your faith, and use that as the way that we determine how to care for creation and make it a priority to care for both planet and neighbors. So let's start with what is creation care? Whoops. So creation care is the act of having compassion for all living things, people, plants, and animals. There's no person who is of more importance. There's no animal who's of more importance. It's just that we, through our lens of religion and faith, are giving compassion and giving value to all living things. And why should we care? I think it's really easy for people to say, oh, we're dealing with this crisis, we're dealing with that. We don't need to focus on the environment. Well, everything intersects. COVID-19 is not a pandemic because of nothing else that's happened. Creation has definitely, our destruction of creation has impacted the way that this pandemic has spread and grown, and we need to keep in mind that if we don't care for creation, there is science that's showing we're gonna have more pandemics like this. We have to remember, I see a typo, but we want the planet to exist beyond us. We want it to last for generations and generations. We don't want our children and grandchildren to never see bumblebees or to never see an oak tree. We also care as Christians because scripture tells us to care. Starting in Genesis, God gave us dominion over all the earth, which doesn't mean God gave us the opportunity to destruct the earth. It means that God gave us this precious planet and we have to care for it. And then finally, specifically the United Methodist Church notes in social principles, all creation is the Lord's, and we are responsible for the ways in which we use and abuse it. Water, air, soil, minerals, energy resources, plants, animal life, and space are to be valued and conserved because they are God's creation, and not solely because they are useful to human beings. So sort of sit with that and think about what your relationship with creation is. What's your relationship with nature? And has your relationship with the environment changed since we've all been sheltering in place? There are lots of barriers for people in engaging in caring for the earth, caring for other people, and creation care in general. One of the biggest problems is that many people believe that caring for the earth is sort of a privilege or it's only meant for the elite. Or frequently you hear that this is a white issue and that only white people are supposed to be working in this space and nobody else needs to be. Well, that's not true. We all live on this planet and therefore we're all impacted by each other's decisions and what goes what's going extinct, what we're not able to get to. So we all have a stake in creation care. Then there's groups of people who don't believe in climate change, and there are ways to work around that in your faith space. You can give sources for education, do different discussion groups, but there are some people who are just never going to see that climate change is real. Or if they do believe it's real, they're not going to see that humans have any impact in that. There's definitely a lack of education or access to education about various environmental issues, depending on where you live, what schools you go to. I was fortunate enough to go to a high school that gave value to the environment, and so I had environmental science taught to me. But I recognize that that's not something everybody has. So if you don't start learning about these problems and caring about the earth, even if it's just that your family teaches you how to recycle from an early age, it can be hard to engage as an adult. And then one of the biggest issues we're dealing with, and we're seeing it very prevalently now, is the issue of racism, both systemic racism and environmental racism. So before we jump into environmental racism, let's take a look at what exactly systemic racism is. So systemic racism or institutional racism are systems that are in place that create and maintain racial inequality in nearly every facet of life for people of color. And most frequently, we're seeing a significant disadvantage for African Americans. So you can see an image below from one of the many protests that have been happening around Black Lives Matter recently. And we have to remember that this isn't a thing on its own. This has been happening for a long, long time. This systemic racism can be traced back to redlining, for example, which began in the 1930s. When home loan companies started assessing different neighborhoods and giving them a risk value and not giving loans to certain areas, which happened to be predominantly Black and people of color. And what we have to understand is that systemic racism isn't me saying, oh, you're so racist. It's a structure that we live within, and certain people benefit from it and others don't. We can't break the system down until we start recognizing things like white privilege and recognizing that some people are at an advantage just because of their skin color. It has nothing to do with their education, has nothing to do with their wealth. It's just skin color and the assumptions made around that. So instead of dwelling in a everyone is racist sort of mindset, we need to think about, okay, what are these things that I'm able to do that these people can't do, and why is that? And why has it been like this for 100 years? Why has it been like this for 400 years? So some of those questions have to be tackled before we can really step into working to cure issues of racism and specifically issues of environmental racism within our society. Like I said, environmental racism isn't anything new. Environmental racism is defined as the disproportionate toxic and industrial contamination in neighborhoods where people of color live, work, worship, and play. And that comes directly from the UMC Book of Resolutions. We'll talk about this graphic in a minute, but first I'm going to show you a short video that will give you a little background on environmental racism and environmental justice.
When we think of racial injustice, we think police brutality or the criminal justice system. But what about our air and water? Environmental racism. It's about policies and practices that discriminate against communities of color by making them live near landfills, sewage plants, and other polluting facilities. And while poverty has a lot to do with it, the leading environmental justice expert told me this.
Racism trumps class. Even middle-income African Americans are more likely to
to live in more polluted neighborhoods. In fact, one study found that Black Americans making $50,000 to $60,000 a year are more likely to live in polluted neighborhoods than white Americans who make just $10,000 a year. Flint, Michigan is a textbook case of environmental racism. It's where 100,000 residents have been poisoned with toxic water contaminated by high levels of lead. Why? Because the state was trying to save a buck. Flint is around 57% Black, with 40% of its population living in poverty. Residents protested the dirty water for over a year, but were ignored. And that's how environmental racism plays out. Minority communities have much less political clout, so regulators can and often do ignore them. And not far from Flint is Detroit, where 83% of the population is Black. It's home to the most polluted zip code in Michigan. Zip code is the most powerful predictor of health, and all communities and all zip codes are not created equal. Southwest Detroit is surrounded by a lot of industry like salt mining, steel production, tar sands oil refining, and coal burning. And that's meant that 1.6 million pounds of chemicals enter that community yearly. Not coincidentally, Wayne County, where Detroit is, has the highest number of children's asthma cases in the state. But look, environmental racism isn't just a Michigan story, it's an American story. Take, for example, Louisiana's Cancer Alley, an 85-mile stretch along the Mississippi River. It's known for its over 200 petrochemical plants and a high rate of cancer, mainly among Black residents. So, is there anyone protecting folks from environmental racism? Well, there's supposed to be. The Environmental Protection Agency has a special department called the Office of Civil Rights, but in its 22-year history, the office has never formally found a single case of discrimination. In fact, more than 90% of communities that make complaints find them rejected or dismissed. On top of that, the Guardian newspaper recently revealed that U.S. authorities across the country are deliberately distorting water tests in cities like Detroit and Philadelphia to minimize the reported amount of lead in the water. Environmental racism, while not always the most visible form, is also widespread. So, when is enough enough?
So that gives you a little bit of an overview and focuses in on Flint, Michigan, which, like they said, is one of sort of the textbook examples of environmental racism. Still to this day, people in Flint, Michigan don't have access to clean drinking water. And it's clear that much of that is due to race. Robert Bullard, who was quoted in the video, is often thought of as the father or grandfather of environmental justice. And he said zip code is the most significant predictor of environmental racism. And this graphic, which I agree with as well, says that race is the most significant predictor of a person living near contaminated air, water, or soil. And then from race, we can look at other things like income level, education level, and those sort of all work together into how much a population is cared for, and how much their environment is cared for. You're not going to see, in Georgia, for example, you're not going to see any sort of landfill or power plant go into the middle of Buckhead. It's not going to happen. Instead, and we'll talk about this in a little while, there are landfills that have been burning for months and months, located in Southwest Atlanta, and they're in predominantly Black neighborhoods, and they're not getting any of the legislation or support that they need. People of color in Georgia and beyond tend to often be located in areas where there's higher air pollution. They might be near an area where trucks idle for hours and hours at a time, and so they're inhaling all of those toxic fumes. They might be located near a power plant, and if it's coal burning, then coal ash can be leaching toxic chemicals into the ground. So there are just so many different ways that we see environmental racism playing out. More within the city lines, we can see contaminated creek beds, which you know, if they weren't running right behind houses, maybe people wouldn't care, but with it running behind your house and there being garbage and toxic sludge and waste in it, you can't help but feel like perhaps the city is intentionally neglecting you. So what are some examples of environmental racism? Environmental racism embodies this fact that the disproportionate number of Black, Indigenous, and people of color are living within 3 miles of an air polluting power plant. There's also the example of the complete disregard for safe drinking water, which Flint, Michigan was an example, but right here in our home, Juliet, Georgia, which is Macon County, has been battling against Georgia Power and Plant Share because their drinking water, their groundwater isn't safe to drink. Many of the residents there rely on well water for everything in their house. And so thankfully, a group called Altamaha Riverkeeper came in and started testing the water around the area and discovered that there were high levels of contaminants in almost every sample. And yet, the debate has continued for several months this year. And part of the issue too is that coal ash is not actually considered toxic or hazardous by the Environmental Protection Association. And so therefore, you know, it's hard to fight that if it's not actually a toxin. And then the last example I have is this idea of allowing faulty evacuation plans and safety mechanisms to continue to operate in floodplains and other areas where we know that natural disasters occur regularly, and not taking the time to regularly check them and upgrade them. So Hurricane Katrina in 2005, we saw that the levees and flood walls in New Orleans and greater New Orleans failed, and more than 50 of them failed within like less than 24 hours. So an investigation followed, and it was discovered that many of them failed because of faulty design. There was just sort of an assumption done by the builders that these were gonna be strong enough to hold anything instead of actually doing tests around it. And unfortunately, they didn't hold. And so we saw many areas that are predominantly people of color affected by this, losing their homes, they lost businesses. Then they came back to start cleaning up, and people weren't able to afford to rebuild their homes and their businesses. So then you see businesses sitting abandoned. People come in, often white people come in, and will take over that business or take over an area, which pushes out all of the Black people and people of color in that area, and then sort of changes the whole racial makeup of the area. So we have the environmental disaster that happens and impacts people, and then it continues to spiral down into people not being able to rebuild their communities and their businesses. So as I referenced a few minutes ago, in Fairburn, Georgia, there is a landfill fire that started burning in September 2018. And it burned solidly for about 9 months. Gipple helped co-host some town hall meetings with the city officials in Fairburn, and there was a little bit of coverage about the fire happening on various local news sources, but not much has really happened in that sense. The owner of the landfill was found to be operating it illegally. He was arrested 3 times, and it still didn't go out. The fire wasn't put out. The city didn't come in to try to help folks find a way to have at least clean air to breathe in their homes because the smell was so bad and it was releasing different toxins into the air. People with breathing issues, people with asthma were having trouble even going outside of their homes. And eventually this turned into having a rally at the state capitol. And unfortunately, though we thought that everything was getting better, a couple of months ago in early 2020, we saw a report that the fire was burning again. So this continual neglect of the land and neglect of people is not only not creation care, but in these predominantly Black neighborhoods is an example of environmental racism. So how do we combat that? That's where environmental justice comes in. To combat environmental justice, to combat environmental racism, we have to have environmental justice. And environmental justice is defined by the EPA as the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So environmental justice is sort of our embodiment of creation care. It cares for the planet, it cares for people, and it lets no one be put off because of their color, their skin color, their ethnicity, or income. Nothing is a barrier. So there is a ton of history behind this movement, and I'm going to show you a quick video on that as well.
Nationally, facilities where we dump our garbage and process dangerous chemicals tend to be located in poor and minority communities. The people who live there have little or no protection from the industries around them, and things could get worse. So there's this idea of environmental justice. It's pretty simple. Communities shouldn't be forced to deal with more pollution because they belong to a certain race, national origin, or income bracket. Yet America has struggled over the years to implement any serious policy that actually protects these communities. So let's lay out the ways the government has failed them.
We will not allow one county to become a dump site.
The fight for environmental justice took off in 1982, when residents of Warren County, North Carolina mounted mass demonstrations against the plan to dump contaminated soil in a landfill in their community. The EPA investigated 4 similar landfills in southern states and found that they were all located in Black or low-income neighborhoods. In 1987, the United Church of Christ Racial Justice Commission found that around the country, hazardous waste facilities were more likely to be located in mostly minority communities. Amid mounting proof, the federal government was forced to act. So in 1992, President George H.W. Bush founded the Office of Environmental Justice inside the EPA. 2 years later, President Bill Clinton signed an executive order requiring federal agencies to consider environmental justice in all of their policies, as well as extending civil rights protection to environmental discrimination. But Congress never passed a bill to make Clinton's executive order law. Then came George W. Bush. His administration shifted the focus of the Office of Environmental Justice from protecting low-income and minority communities to all people, leaving vulnerable populations without a federal environmental advocate.
80% of New Orleans, including much of downtown, is underwater.
Under Bush, many environmental civil rights claims were rejected or delayed for years. In 2009, after President Barack Obama's election, his administration recommitted to environmental justice.
Generally speaking, in this country, a lot of environmentally problematic facilities tend to be located in places where poor folks live.
Yet, during the 2 years Democrats controlled the House, the Senate, and the White House, they didn't file a single bill focused on strengthening environmental justice protections. Passing major environmental legislation faded further when Republicans took control of Congress in the 2010 midterm elections. Now, President Donald J. Trump is making good on his vow to weaken the EPA.
Environmental protection, what they do is a disgrace. Every week they come out with new regulations. They're making it impossible.
The environment.
They will be fine with the environment. We can leave a little bit.
This budget, a 31% cut to the EPA, $2.6 billion cut away from the EPA, that's what the president wants. As the EPA loses funding and regulations are rolled back, vulnerable communities may very likely fall through the cracks. I'm Talia Buford. I'll be covering your communities and digging into systemic environmental injustice. If you have something to tell me, email me at talia.buford@propublica.com.
So that was a little bit of an overview of environmental justice, and this is just a timeline laid out for you to see the brief history of how the big environmental justice movement got started in the early 80s. So Warren County, which is where all of the protests began in 1982, was going to have a PCB landfill, which is toxic. It leaches toxins into the water and the environment. And that's when people decided to use their voices and stand up and say, no, this isn't going to happen. We're not going to allow it. As they said in the video, then the study was published in 1987 by the United Church of Christ, which brought to light all of these issues of justice and racism within the environmental movement and issues. And so then different agencies were created, and sometimes they help and sometimes they don't. But the environmental justice movement dates way further back than some of us might know. We can start with Governor Hunt in the Warren County area. His administration on December 20th, 1978, announced that public sentiment would not deter the state from burying the PCBs in Warren County. And so it took until from 1978 to 1982 for much movement to happen, for sort of this media coverage and making it public to happen. The landfill was in a predominantly Black area of North Carolina, and people like Robert Bullard were fed up with it. So within a few months of burying the PCBs, the EPA found significant PCB air emissions at the landfill and up to half a mile away. But the citizens didn't learn about this report and study for another 15 years. So they're inhaling and consuming these toxins unknowingly for 15 years. And the 60,000 tons of PCB contaminated soil, once the city decided that they were going to handle this, were just buried 7 feet. We're just buried underground within 7 feet of groundwater. And so that's not really a resolution, and therefore environmental justice continues to be important both in Warren County and beyond. So why today is environmental justice still necessary? Green Law is a great resource. Their website offers tons and tons of statistics and data points on environmental justice and environmental racism. They completed a study of 14 metro Atlanta counties looking at environmental justice hotspots and cold spots. So places that were very active and not very active in environmental justice. Environmental justice hotspots are the blocks that contain the most pollution points, poorest economic conditions, highest linguistic isolation rates, and the largest minority populations in the metro Atlanta region. So they identified 52, or about 4% of all the blocks in metro Atlanta as environmental justice hotspots. That's a problem. Hispanics are more than twice as likely as whites to live in areas where there are high levels of particulate matter, which causes respiratory problems and can flare up your asthma. African Americans are more likely than white people to be located close to dirty coal-fired power plants, which can be seen all around Georgia. African American children are 5 times more likely than white children to die from asthma because of poor air conditions, and are 5 times more likely than white children to have lead poisoning, which you can see with the Flint water crisis, how easy that could be. And then 3 out of 5 African and Latino Americans live in communities with abandoned toxic waste sites. And in some areas, some parts of Georgia, they're working to clean up these sites, but so frequently they've been there for a long time and not thought about, and people have to have somewhere to live, and so they live in these areas where they're consuming and breathing in toxins all day, every day. 46% of housing units for the poor or low income sit within a mile of factories that reported toxic emissions to the EPA. And these communities are surrounded disproportionately by polluting facilities, meaning that not only is the air and water quality worse, but so is the quality of life. Imagine if you couldn't go outside because you were afraid that you wouldn't be able to breathe, or you were afraid to go walk along the local stream because you weren't sure what sort of waste you were going to find in there. Imagine if your local stream, instead of water, was flowing with raw sewage. These things are happening to our neighbors in Georgia, and we need to stand up for folks and fight for what's right. People deserve safe drinking water, a safe place to live, clean air to breathe. Many facilities that people deem desirable in society, like recycling centers and public transportation, are some of the worst offenders with pollutants. And so we look at where these are, they're often once again, in poor neighborhoods and communities of color. And therefore, people who are using, for example, public transportation are also being hurt by the way that these facilities are managed and built. So why should we care as people of faith? It's really easy to put this all on the government and say the government should fix it, but we can see that that's not happening. So we have to care because it's directly related to all of the world's religious teachings. Our care for neighbor and care for planet are so key. I really enjoyed this quote. We're all sharing a house that's on fire and everyone's looking at each other saying they didn't start it. And that's exactly what the environmental justice movement feels like so often. People don't want to take responsibility, whether it's everybody on Earth doesn't want to take responsibility for humanity's impact on the planet, or that it's simply this group of people doesn't feel like they did anything wrong, or we have to have power plants, otherwise we won't have power. And so nobody wants to take responsibility for their part. But if we can all start to see that we're each part of this problem, we can work towards finding a solution and finding ways to elevate the voices of those who aren't able to speak up and fight for their own rights because they're often just disregarded. Some of what we believe at GIPL includes, as people of faith, we affirm our call to advocate for the responsible and just stewardship of God's creation, as well as the just and equitable treatment of our neighbors. So that's to say that in the way that we care for the environment, we are also caring for people. We are taking into consideration the community, the humanity that is within all of those people, and considering that as we make decisions about how to build or treat or care for the earth. We affirm that neither is possible without the other, that justice for creation cannot be achieved without fully addressing the environmental injustices impacting our neighbors and communities. And that sort of touches on this idea of intersectionality once again. We can't address one type of racism and not address another type. We can't seek justice for just one thing and not consider the other. They're all intertwined. And finally, because of this, we believe that this call requires us to engage in faithful environmental action and policy change. So at GIPL, we both support faith communities in their efforts to become more sustainable and to become green, but we also work at the policy level and advocate for different laws and bills to pass so that we can have a planet for longer than the next 10 years. Now, the United Methodist Church also has specific thoughts on why we should care about the environment and the importance of environmental justice. And I think most importantly, it's just this first bullet, that the United Methodist Church is committed to understanding and eliminating environmental racism. So what does that look like in your faith community? Everyone is at different levels of understanding this. So maybe in your faith community, that is reading a book together as a community and then having discussion groups around it to start to understand what the history of environmental justice and racism is. Maybe it's watching a documentary on systemic racism and discussing it. Or maybe you're an action-oriented person and you want to be out in the streets protesting, or you want to be at the Capitol lobbying. And there are ways for everyone at every level to engage in environmental justice. Also important is that people of color and non-citizens in the US are usually the least able politically and economically to affect the political institutions that make the decisions that allow these injustices to happen. And knowing that we have voices that we can raise for those who are often overlooked, we have to use that. I believe that that's our call from God, from the Creator, our call as Christians, our call as people of faith. We have to care for the marginalized and elevate voices. And like I've said a few times, all the world's religions really do talk about caring for the marginalized, caring for our neighbors, caring for the earth. I think tikkun olam is one of the most commonly known phrases. It's Hebrew for world repair, but it has sort of taken on this new life of the pursuit of social justice, which includes environmental justice for all. We can see from the Quran, we can see it in Buddhism, we can see it in really name a religion, and it's there. So all of us, at least at some point, we're taught to care for planet and care for people. So now that you've heard all of the sort of depressing information and statistics around environmental racism right here at home and beyond, what can you do? And these are things that you don't have to be in a space to gather with folks. You can do these from home. You can support and volunteer for local projects and causes. If you visit the GIPL website, you visit the UMC Creation Justice website and get the newsletters, you will see different opportunities for you to engage, whether that's through a food drive to help an area that is a food desert, or maybe you see that GIPL or the Sierra Club or another environmental organization is going down to protest at the Capitol, and you and a few others feel like you would like to engage in that. And supporting financially helps these organizations too. So if you are not feeling inclined to go out in public, one of the ways you can support these different organizations is just by making a gift. Starting a book study in your faith community is a great way to engage. One of the books, I don't know if you'll be able to see it, that I would recommend is Black Faces, White Spaces. It's written by Carolyn Finney, and it talks about where Black people fit into these different environmental spaces and where do Black people fit into the environmental movement generally. So highly recommend that, but also I'm always happy to offer book suggestions. You can invite guest lecturers into your space or speakers, and intentionally invite people of color to speak from their perspective and their experiences. That helps expand everyone's horizons, and it keeps the story from being one-sided. You can engage in letter writing, another way to both help yourself and elevate voices of those who can't be heard or aren't heard. Voting is so important. Please vote. And make sure you're registered to vote. It's really easy to check online. Make sure you're registered, get out and vote. And then finally, I would suggest hosting a film series. If you're watching a documentary, Years of Living Dangerously is a great one. They're a series of multiple one-hour episodes that combine celebrities as well as people of faith and environmentalists to talk about these different issues that we're seeing, and they fly all over the world so that you can see ice melting in Antarctica and New Orleans sinking into the ocean. And it gives you, it's just a great way to open up a discussion about how we can engage as people of faith. And then finally, make sure you're signed up for the UMC Creation Care newsletters, so that you continue to get great information about activities to engage in and new resources. And I would say you're always welcome to reach out to GIPL as well. We are here to support you. We are here to answer questions. We are here to offer resources. So reach out to your local organizations and get involved in environmental justice. Any questions?
Of course. You know I always have questions, Whitney. So
Yes.
first of all, thank you so very, very, very much. This was really awesome. And just to give people a little context, this has been filmed just post-COVID. We're sort of re-getting inside, but also during the heartbreaking, crushing situation going on with the around race, death, and police departments. And more importantly, systemic racism. And so I want to really thank you again for addressing this, giving us context. Like, you know, right now people are sort of focused on, well, it's just the police. It's not. It is across the board. And so talking about these communities, and this is why it was so important for us to do this, is the continued systemic racism that happens in the communities in regards to pollution and fragile situations with, you know, people of color and communities. Thank you so much for bringing up that Green Law report. That was so eye-opening when it came out.
Yes, definitely.
Right, something that can live. So I'm going to give one little plug because, like I said, I'm going to date it. But one of the things that we've just had the primary elections here in Georgia, which was a catastrophe. And so one of the other things I'm telling people to do is become a poll volunteer, because 70-year-olds can handle technology. Let's just be honest. I love all my 70-year-olds, but we got to keep people in there who understand technology. And two, if you cannot work a poll, then please volunteer to be a poll watcher and be prepared to say you can get provisional ballots here and you can drop off that kind of thing. So being able to help people or just sit there and hold their hand and let them call and help if there's a problem with voting. So you gave us a great list of things to do. I do also want to say that IPL chapters are all over the country, so please get plugged into your IPL thing. One of the things I know that has happened in the past is IPL gets videos that they can hand out free to faith communities. Is that still happening?
That is still happening. And actually there's one coming up next Sunday, June 28th. We've got info about it on the GIPL website, that they're doing a screening of, oh my gosh, what's it called? The Condor and the Eagle, I think is the name of it. So yes, they're offering, they definitely in this time of us social distancing too, are offering free film screenings and sort of post viewing conversations or talkbacks.
So GIPL has been instrumental in helping churches build green teams across Georgia. What are the 3 top things you recommend for people building green teams who are starting from scratch?
I would say reach out to GIPL. We have a great green team coaching sort of workshop, and it's actually 12 months of help. So we help you get started. We help you put together your covenant so that you understand what you as a green team and you as a faith community are working towards collectively. So that's my shameless plug, number 1. Number 2, I would say start small. If your faith community doesn't have a recycling setup at this point, start there. Don't start with let's put solar panels on the roof. You're jumping over so many different things so many different steps that will get you there. So start small. Start with recycling. Start with no longer using styrofoam for your coffee hour. Think of creative ways to reuse different things that you use in worship. How can you reuse bulletins? I know that we've got one green team who takes the bulletins, and they have a cookie sale every year, and they take the bulletins and make them into sort of the pouches for the cookies. Get creative. And then my 3rd one would be educate yourself. it's easy to follow folks on Instagram right now or Facebook and get information directly from the source, but also stay attuned to sort of what's happening in your city, in your state, what's happening across the country. Read books, read articles, make sure you're staying current on issues, whether it's legislative or you find out that the landfill behind your house is burning, but definitely stay current and continue learning.
Super. Okay, so I'm going to put in 2 shameless plugs, and I've got one more question, and then we'll say thank you very much and have a lovely day.
Okay.
So National Creation Justice page on Facebook is a great place to stay plugged in with other United Methodists. And Gipple has a Facebook page, so they can also be there. And I am a social media person, and I'm like, share. It makes a difference, right? People see you be an example. It will make a difference. All right.
Yes.
If you have an existing green team and you're struggling a bit, what do you recommend?
After reaching out to Gipple.
Right, after reaching out to Gipple.
I would sit down with the people in your green team and evaluate what's going on. Step back from trying to address whatever issue or issues you think that you're working on and figure out what's not functioning. Are you in the midst of a pastoral transition? Are you working on paying off the mortgage on the building? And is that more important congregationally than, planting the garden outside? So I would say to take a step back and consider all of the factors that could be impacting your ministry. And just evaluate if this is the right time to be pursuing this thing, or is this the time that you just need to double down on getting folks to use reusable cups for coffee hour instead of styrofoam or plastic. So don't give up, evaluate what's going on, and reach out to Gipple.
Super. Hey, Whitney, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. Michael, do you have anything else?
I just wanted to ask Whitney, so a lot of focus has been on the environmental costs that communities of color pay for being close to some of these sites, and less on the unwarranted benefits that other communities get. And how do you think the framing of that affects how we act?
I think framing of the issue without acknowledging that there is some privilege for people outside of this. So not acknowledging that by having a higher income or not having darker skin or black skin is giving you opportunities and the advantage to not live in an area that could become a dumping ground or an area for trucks to idle is damaging. It's sort of an out for everyone else to have to care if you're not being affected immediately. And I think that we have to work on looking at, it's a both and issue. So yes, Black people, low income people, people of color are definitely paying a higher price for this, both in their health and energy cost. And also we need to acknowledge that yes, there is a group of people who is indirectly or directly benefiting from this. And where do we find that middle ground? How do the two groups of people come together to fight for legislation that supports both groups and helps us keep our planet healthy and growing?
Thank you.
Sure.
And what do you think are some of the appreciative inquiry, great examples of people of color working together with white ally communities?
That's a great question. I'm trying to think of a local example because it's really easy. I mean, there's tons of examples out there right now of communities of different races working together for the greater good. Trying to think. I don't know. Do you have a good local example?
I think there are some that are starting to make good efforts.
Mm-hmm.
One of those might be some of the work that I've seen in partnership across Proctor Creek.
Yes.
There might be others in terms of advocacy.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly in cases like Georgia Interfaith Power and Light and Georgia Watch and
Mm-hmm.
Partnership for Southern Equity. But I don't necessarily see like, here is a white ally community that has
Right.
said, we're a white ally community and we're reaching out as much. And I think that puts on white ally communities some ownership to
Mm-hmm.
like, why is that? That's not the case. That we've
Mm-hmm.
partnered more with different communities and we're working together to work on these challenges, because all of us benefit from the energy that comes from those power plants that
Mm-hmm.
end up close to those communities. And so we all have something to gain from whatever power we may generate. So how could we work together where we both benefit from the power,
Right.
but neither of the communities suffers the negative consequences of how we pick and what we pick.
Mm-hmm. One of the great things that I've seen recently coming out of sort of the police brutality, systemic racism, but coming into the faith space is these, I think it's a 21-day challenge of anti-racism.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a chance for different churches, and I assume communities beyond, faith communities beyond churches, to really deeply engage in the work of anti-racism. I think it's not enough to say that we're not racist as a faith community. We have to work actively to be anti-racist. And that means taking the time to educate yourself so that you can make those connections between a white faith space and a black faith space and start to work together. Sunday is the most segregated day of the week. We all know that. We can see that when we go into our churches, but there are definitely ways that we can be building bridges. Black UMC churches and white UMC churches follow the same doctrines. We're not worshiping different things. So I think, once we get through this education period and learning, then we can start taking action together. So.
Thank you very much for coming and sharing.
Absolutely.
We will have other sessions like this in People of the Margins. This is a continuing series, and we look forward to having viewers come and see some of our other recordings. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thank y'all so much. I didn't realize what time it is. I have to go.
No worries. See you later, Beth. Thank you
Bye.
again, Whitney. That was
Bye,
great.
all.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Whitney. Bye.
No problem. Bye.